Okay. So I'm here today to tell you a little bit about this project that I've been working on, looking at the physical and economic effects of distributed PV generation on California's distribution system. And I've been working on this with Duncan Calloway, who's a professor in the Energy and Resources group, and a really great undergraduate research assistant by the name of Paul Kausman. So before I dive in, I just want to make sure, probably most people in this audience are familiar, but I just want to make sure we're all on the same page about what we mean when we say distribution system. This is a nice diagram from PG&E, and we're basically talking about this number 6 down here, which is the part of the electric grid that comes after the substation and delivers powers to the end-use homes and businesses. So that's been the focus of this project. So what's the motivation for looking at the effect of PV on the distribution system? One way of looking at it is around this idea of net metering, which is the idea that we're going to pay photovoltaic power the full retail rate for power rather than the wholesale rate. And if we set aside for just a moment ideas about addressing externalities from climate change and market transformation and all that, just on a purely current sort of economic basis, that feels like a subsidy for PV because it's allowing people with PV on their roofs to benefit from the grid, to buy and sell power whenever they need to without necessarily paying the retail part of the tariff, or at least not paying as much of it, that goes to maintain that grid. On the other hand, it's possible that putting PV on rooftops actually has some benefits for the distribution system that would justify valuing it a little more highly than other sources of power. And so some might argue that to some extent paying it more is justified. On the other hand, if you're a utility, you might be concerned that PV on rooftops will actually have negative effects on the distribution system that make it even more of a subsidy than it would otherwise be, such as effects on voltage. And so what we're trying to do here is basically do some simulation and modeling to get a handle on how big these effects might be and estimate their economic importance. So I'm just going to open with some key findings, and then I'll sort of walk you through how we got there. So one thing is that the energy value of PV appears to be far larger in magnitude than any economic effect that it has on the distribution system. So we're not talking about things that double the value of PV or anything on that order. But we do think there might be a capacity investment deferral benefit that is smaller than the energy benefit, but still potentially meaningful if we look at the scale of the whole California system. It takes a lot of assumptions and judgment calls to model this, so there's some uncertainty around it, but I'll present you with sort of a range of where we think that benefit might be. And we did look at some other effects, and for the most part they appear to be small based on the models that we ran, although we weren't able to really assign a firm economic value to everything for lack of data. So this is the method. Don't worry, we're not going to get into the details of every little box here, but I just want to sort of give you the big picture. And I think we can mostly do that just by sort of moving along the top here. Sort of the core of this work was a computer modeling of distribution feeders, distribution lines, using this software called GridLab-D, which comes from Pacific Northwest National Lab. It's open source, and it's designed for investigating distribution system questions like this. So we run a series of simulations under different conditions. We get some physical outputs from GridLab-D as to what happens on these feeders under different conditions over a simulated year. And then for some of those physical outputs, we do some post-processing with economic data that we've got from PG&E or California ISO, and we're able to estimate an economic value for some of the physical effects. Some of the effects we didn't really have the data to change into economic value, so we just report those as physical results. Today I'm mostly going to focus on the part that we were able to do economic for. And now I just want to take you a little bit through some of the inputs so you can get a flavor of what these simulations look like. So we have the taxonomy feeders for California, and these were actually gathered by Pacific Northwest National Lab, and they come from real utilities throughout the U.S. We used the 8 of them that come from California climate regions, and they're intended to be representative, broadly speaking, of distribution feeders that are actually found on the West Coast in the desert Southwest. We have some PV production data from Solar City. They basically give us their whole database of generation at their photovoltaic installations. So we are actually using real-life data for generation, and I'll get into why that's a great thing in a moment. And then we have some weather data from National Renewable Energy Lab and Lawrence Berkeley National Lab that we put into the simulation to drive the building loads. So there are building models on these taxonomy feeders, and they have scheduled sort of occupancy loads, and then they also respond to the weather in terms of their HVAC power use and things like that. So just a real brief, oh, that actually shows up pretty well on this projector. Sometimes it's faded out. But so this is a visualization I did of just one of the taxonomy feeders, so you can get a sense of sort of the scale and what one of these things looks like. And I will zoom in a little here so you can see more clearly the different parts. And so basically, this is, it has all the things you'd expect to see on a distribution feeder. It has lines, loads, transformers, switches, fuses, meters, all that kind of stuff. And we don't actually know exactly the physical layout of these feeders because they're anonymized, but we do know the length of each line segment. So I used a graph layout program to create a realistic or possible layout for these things, and I used that for the geographic part of the work. Then I selected some photovoltaic generation sites from Solar City that were near to the weather stations where I had data. So that green square is a weather station, and these dots around it are all Solar City photovoltaic installations that I have generation data from. And then it's basically a matter of taking these taxonomy feeders and superimposing them to scale on the photovoltaic generation sites. And I take each load in the taxonomy feeder, and I match it up to the closest Solar City profile. And so when I add PV to one of these buildings in the simulation, it's using a profile that comes from a geographically realistic location. And that's a really neat sort of new thing about this work, is that rather than just using a single PV generation profile for the whole feeder, we're actually able to incorporate some of the geographic diversity that exists in real life. So for instance, when a cloud moves over this region, it might reduce generation on one side of the feeder but not the other. And when you're talking about voltage impacts and things like that, accounting for that diversity can be really important. And we're able to do that clearly not with a separate profile for every single building, but at least with a fair level of granularity along the feeder. So we're really happy to be able to do that. So that's sort of the inputs. We run each of these feeder setups with varying amounts of photovoltaic penetration, so basically varying numbers of buildings that have PV. And we also vary the location or the weather, and I have 3 locations, Berkeley, Los Angeles, and Sacramento. So we kind of get a sense of how these things would operate across California. And I'm going to show you a little bit about the results that we get from those simulations now. So first we'll do the energy value, because that's fairly straightforward. We basically look at the energy that is used on these feeders with PV at varying levels versus the energy that was used by them without. And then we value that by multiplying it by the locational marginal price of energy at these times throughout the simulated year, which in our case spanned from September 2011 to September 2012, because that's what we have data for. And this value is based on a weighted average of feeders and climates that's intended to be representative of PG&E's service territory. And we find that the energy value is about 3.5 cents per kilowatt hour. And to sort of frame that number a little bit, that's about 18% higher than the average weighted locational marginal price of energy during this year. And the reason that it's higher is because PV has advantages over sort of a generic, steady energy source. And one of those is that it tends to generate during the day when prices tend to be higher than at night. And the other thing is that it can reduce losses in the distribution system because it generates the power closer to where it's used, right at the load, basically. And so less power has to come in over the distribution lines, and therefore less is lost as losses. So a kilowatt hour of PV power tends to displace a little bit more than a kilowatt hour of generation. And there probably are also even a slightly higher advantage because of transmission losses, but we don't have a transmission model in this work, so I can't say anything definitive about that. So next I want to talk about the capacity benefit, and this is kind of I think a fairly new and interesting aspect of this work. We wanted to estimate basically how much PV might allow us to defer investments in distribution capacity. So the idea is basically load grows on the distribution system over time, and you have to add transformers or upgrade transformers, or you have to maybe upgrade conductor to allow more power to flow in. And those investments are driven largely by the peak load on the feeder, because all those components have to be sized for the largest amount of energy we expect those systems to handle. And so if PV can reduce the load a little bit at those peak times, it might allow us to defer or even avoid some of those capacity investments, and that has a financial or economic benefit. So these are the physical results of the peak load reduction, and basically each, we don't need to worry about understanding every single line here, but I wanted to show you the range of results that we got, because I think the variation is one of the really interesting parts of the work. So each of the different colors here represents a different taxonomy feeder. So there are different layouts of power lines and customers. And then the shapes represent the different climate locations that we simulated the feeders in. And the black shapes with the dotted lines show the means for each location. And so, again, sort of what I want to call your attention to here is just the range of possibilities. So we see at like 100% PV penetration, your peak load reduction might be anywhere from 6 or 7% to 35% for the annual peak, and that just depends on the arrangement of the loads and the weather and how PV aligns, how the PV production aligns in time with the loads. Now, we did, after we saw this, we did a little more investigation, a little more careful investigation of how our simulated building loads coming out of GridLab-D matched with the actual loads that appear in PG&E's system, and we think there's reason to believe that probably the Berkeley and Sacramento results here are a little bit optimistic, and that with more realistic load profiles, we would see stuff more in the Sacramento range, more in the 10%-ish peak load reduction. So bear that in mind, that some of these estimates of capacity value might be a little optimistic, and I'm happy to talk about that afterwards if anybody would like. So how do we turn that physical peak load reduction into an economic value? This is basically the model. So we were fortunate again to have another really great, unique data set, this time from PG&E, about all of their distribution feeders, their current loading relative to their capacity, and PG&E's projected growth rates for the next 5 years, which they caution us are just guesses and depend on conditions, of course, but they're the best we've got. So the blue line here represents the trajectory of load at a feeder growing over time from our 10-year time horizon of 2012 to 2022. And then the purple line represents what we might see with PV. And so we're assuming that we're going to reach a certain target penetration in 2022, and we're going to have some sort of ramp of solar deployment up until then, right? It's not all going to appear right away. We're going to see it come gradually over time. And so the purple line represents the peak load with the PV, with that capacity benefit. And then the brown line here is the current capacity of the feeder. And so basically when the load reaches that capacity, we're going to have to do something to upgrade the feeder. And if there's PV involved, we'll probably have to make that investment a little bit later. And the time value of money difference between those two times is basically the capacity benefit of adding PV to that feeder. So this is just sort of one individual scenario, and we basically ran this many hundreds of times with different combinations of our simulations and PG&E's specific feeders to come up with how many projects we think would be deferred and how long. And then we scaled that to PG&E's overall distribution system budget to get a sense of what the systematic dollar value of that benefit would be. And that result is here. And you can see it's basically on the order of potentially hundreds of millions of dollars. And the colors here are as I was saying, the PV ramps up over time. It's installed gradually out to 10 years. We don't know exactly when it would appear. So we did some sensitivities basically to say, does it all come right away? Did we just install our target penetration immediately? Or did we wait until year 10 to install it all? Or some sort of curve that's in between? And so sort of the normal sort of gently upsloping curves that you would expect are sort of in the yellow to green range here. So those are what we think are probably the most realistic results, but we wanted to just look at a range. When we levelize this hundreds of millions of dollars in system benefit, we come up with something in the range of 0.26 to 0.69 cents per kilowatt hour, which, if you recall earlier, we said the energy value was about 3.5 cents per kilowatt hour. So this is something, again, on the order of 10% or so of that, 7 to 20% of the energy value. And you actually get the most levelized capacity value at the lowest penetrations because your first increments of PV are shaving your daytime peaks the most. And I can talk more about the timing afterwards if anybody's interested, but that's the gist of it. So we think this benefit is certainly smaller than the energy value, but it's not completely insignificant necessarily, and so worth thinking about as we decide how to value PV. Finally, I just want to talk briefly about voltage concerns, because this is something that people are concerned about. And basically, so this is voltage regulator operations, which people are concerned are going to go up as cloudy days add more variability to the system. And we have two feeders, actually. We only have two feeders that have voltage regulators that we can look at in this way. But basically what we see is on one feeder, the adding PV does seem to make the regulator operations go up. The regulator has to work more often to keep the voltage in range, and that could potentially cause it to wear out sooner and cause a maintenance expense. But on another feeder that we looked at, it actually reduced the operations a little bit, and that's consistent with the idea that PV might smooth out the daily profile of voltage and allow the regulator to have to change less on sort of an overall daily basis, even if it works a little more on cloudy days. In any case, we think the economic effect of this is pretty small because the total amount that PG&E spends on regulator maintenance and things like that is only about $1.4 million per year. So it's much, much less even than the capacity benefit that we've been looking at. So even in the worst case where PV causes these regulators to work a lot more often and wear out sooner, we don't think that's likely to be a very significant cost on the scale of the power system. And finally, there's just a little bit of a concern that, well, maybe the regulators don't have to work that much harder, but maybe they're actually just not doing a very good job of keeping voltage within an acceptable range. And at least in the cases that we were able to simulate, we don't think there's too much of a problem with that. This is the incidence of the number of voltages outside of ANSI standard range at each of the feeders as penetration goes up. And we can see that generally the voltage is very well controlled here. Generally under 0.1% of readings out of acceptable range. In a few cases, PV does drive that up, but even at the most, it tends to only be about 0.3% of the time. Of course, in real life, these are just typical feeders, and there may be some cases where there are more concerning voltage problems, but we're not seeing any major red alerts from the simulation work that we've done. So, in conclusion, PV does seem to have some of these side benefits that I mentioned at the beginning, and we think it's probably justified to value it at more than a simple wholesale rate. On the other hand, these benefits are relatively small compared to the wholesale cost of energy, and by themselves wouldn't really justify valuing PV at the full retail rate. And whether we want to do that really depends on these, what we think we're getting in terms of climate change and market transformation and all of those other factors. And all of the numbers here that I've presented, I just really want you to take away with a grain of salt, because these are simulations of things that we believe and hope are typical, but there are some assumptions that we've had to make that can't be verified exactly. So we're looking really here to think more about the order of magnitude of these economic values and not sort of a specific pinned down number. So I believe that's what I've got. I have a very large number of people to thank for their insight on this project. I've had a lot of great help and advice, and there they are. Thank you very much.
Questions from... Someone's coming to you with the microphone. All the way in the front.
I can repeat the question if that helps. Oh,
Great study.
thank you.
What do you think would happen if you added storage to this? Did you see things in the development of this model in which you thought, gee, if I just had a lot of storage here, it would help the PV argument?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, the thing, so did everybody hear the question? Did anybody not? It's basically about how storage would change the outcome if we had electrical storage in conjunction with the PV. The thing that we actually spent the most time on in this was the capacity benefit. And certainly, I think we would see a larger and more consistent capacity benefit if we had storage, because what happens as PV gets added, it reduces the peaks during the daytime, and it reduces all the load during the daytime. But eventually, what ends up happening is your new peak is now in the evening. And eventually, the new peak gets to be late enough that adding more PV just doesn't help, because the sun's not shining anymore at the time where your peak is now happening. If you have storage, you can store some of the excess PV power you have during the day, and you can make sure that you have some left for those evening peaks, which are fairly common in California feeders. So certainly if we had storage, we could increase the capacity benefit. And it's something that we are interested in looking into. We haven't quite gotten there with the models yet. But yeah, that's definitely at least one area where it would, I think, make a big difference. Mm-hmm.
So John. Hi, it's John Holmes from SDG&E. I especially appreciated the fact that you worked with GridLab-D, and Pete and El's done a great job helping to develop the capabilities of that system.
Yeah.
I wonder whether there might be opportunity for increased data to be run through your process, because within the territory in San Diego, we've seen substantially compelling data indicating that there are investments required, for example, with load tap changers and cap banks that are exercised significantly more and do represent. I would suggest that it might be interesting to expand your data set to see if findings varied according to the profiles you use.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, I think the topology makes a big difference, and also I think the load profiles, the simulated load profiles that are coming out of GridLab-D are intended to sort of be typical of the United States, and they're not necessarily typical of California, and certainly even what's typical, there's a huge range. We saw, looking at some of PG&E's feeder data, which I'm sure is similar. There's just a huge range in terms of when these feeders have their peaks and how peaky they are and how variable the load is and all that stuff. So yeah, definitely. And if you are interested in sharing some of those models, we'd be interested in working them in. I think when we started this, we felt like we needed to use something open and available because that's what was available, and we didn't know what utilities would be willing to share. But if they are, then yeah, we're interested.
I also want to applaud the fact that you went to industry, specifically to Solar City, to get data. Oftentimes that's a great edification of other than utility data, because it's an independently set up network of information. There are other networks of information that are also available, and I'd maybe suggest if you wanted to, we could talk further about that. I think it's clear that with the penetration of renewables, particularly customer premise located renewables, we're going to see increased amounts of data, and the value of that those assets need to be further explored. So there are real cases where the utility is going to be seeing substantial investments due to the loads that are affluencing, not just generation loads, but also loads from customer premises, both residential, commercial, industrial, that have not currently been part of planning. And so as we look at the integration of renewables over time, there's going to be a whole new set of parameters to design around.
Jerry Braun. This is very valuable work. This is either a question or a suggestion. The cost numbers that you presented are very interesting, but I'm trying to relate them to the prices that we pay to PG&E. For example, the lowest tier PG&E rate for residential is 13 cents per kilowatt hour.
Right.
For customers that are on time of use rates, the peak prices are close to 45 cents per kilowatt hour. And about close to 40% of the PV electricity generated in our area is generated on peak. So, I don't expect you to kind of unravel this comparison, in real time, but I think when you present those numbers, some of us are thinking, how does this relate to the prices that we pay? And those prices are, in principle, cost-based. So just making that connection would be helpful.
Yeah, well, so the short answer is that there's a lot of things that we pay for in the retail tariff that aren't included in the wholesale price of energy. So these were all based, or the energy cost was based on wholesale locational marginal prices. And there's a lot of stuff in there, for instance, maintaining the distribution and transmission systems, and also all of the energy efficiency programs, and there's a lot of things. It is a surprisingly large disparity in some ways, but there's a lot of things in there that we pay for that aren't just wholesale energy.
Well, I think maybe it's just a nomenclature issue then, because wholesale has, to some of us, a connotation of bulk energy as opposed to retail energy, and so the buildup of cost that would be good background to the buildup of cost that results in prices would be a good background to, and where do these numbers fit into that buildup? I think would be helpful.
Okay. Yep.
The subject of cost causality.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
Michael, one more.
Yeah.